quiet town of Harpers Grove, Minnesota had always been a place where people knew each other and word traveled fast. But no one could have predicted the horror that would emerge from a small house on Cherry Street in the summer of 2023. Neighbors knew Samuel and Edith Larson as a kindly retired couple who spent most of their time tending their garden and visiting with friends. But on August 12th, police discovered their bodies inside their own home, igniting a firestorm of scandal and shock. Their granddaughter, Lillian Larson, a petite 17-year-old with a troubled history, was the prime suspect. This documentary traces the steps that led Lillian to a dark place of no return, unraveling a chain of decisions and influences that would end in bloodshed and horror. Lillian had moved in with her grandparents 2 years prior after a strained relationship with her parents. Life under Samuel and Edith's roof was meant to be a fresh start for the wayward teenager, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. Even at the young age of 15, Lillian displayed troubling behavior. She frequently skipped school, was known to sneak out at night, and once had a physical altercation with her grandmother, resulting in a police report that never led to charges. Samuel and Edith, kind but firm, tried to instill discipline, but the relationship quickly soured. The town gossip often hinted at family troubles, but nobody anticipated the violence that would erupt. By the time Lillian turned 16, she had met Jaden Rivers, a local boy with a reputation that preceded him. Jaden, slightly older at 18, was known for his turbulent behavior and involvement in petty crime. The two were inseparable, forming a toxic bond that alarmed Lillian's grandparents. Samuel and Edith tried to break up the relationship, but their attempts only drove Lillian further away, deepening her attachment to Jaden. As their relationship intensified, the young couple's conversations turned darker, focused on fantasies of escape and freedom they decided could only be achieved by eliminating the one obstacle in their way, Lillian's grandparents. In her twisted sense of justification, Lillian came to view Samuel and Edith as the root of her misery, blaming them for every perceived slight and restriction. Jaden fueled these thoughts, reinforcing the idea that they would only find peace once the Larsons were gone. Together, they began formulating a plan, a meticulous yet brutal scheme to end the lives of the two people who had opened their home to Lillian. The plan came together slowly, building piece by piece over hushed conversations in the dead of night and countless text messages exchanged in secrecy. On August 10th, just 2 days before the murder, Lillian and Jaden finalized every detail. They would wait until Samuel and Edith were asleep, enter through the backyard door, and use the tire iron Jaden had taken from his car as their weapon. It would be quick, Lillian assured herself, convinced that once it was over, her life would change for the better. On the night of August 12th, they made their way to the small house on Cherry Street. Jaden gripped the tire iron in one hand, his other hand interlaced with Lillian's. There was no turning back now, their plan was in motion. They entered through the back door as planned, creeping silently through the darkened hallways they knew so well. Lillian led the way to her grandparents' bedroom, her heart racing as she struggled to keep herself calm. Jaden moved beside her with a quiet, focused intensity. The brutality that followed was swift and relentless. Jaden delivered the first blow to Samuel, who was asleep and barely stirred before the fatal strike landed. Edith awoke only to be met by the same vicious assault, leaving her no time to react. Within minutes, both grandparents lay lifeless, their blood staining the sheets and seeping into the carpet. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Lillian's heavy breathing as she stood over the bodies, a mix of adrenaline and fear coursing through her. But for Lillian, the gravity of the crime hadn't sunk in. Instead, she felt an eerie calm, as if a great weight had lifted. Jaden embraced her in the dim room, whispering reassurances that this was the beginning of their new life. Free from her grandparents' rules and expectations, they had crossed a line that could never be undone. Yet at that moment, neither seemed to feel the consequences bearing down on them. After the murders, Lillian and Jaden began a carefully orchestrated effort to conceal the crime. They dragged the bodies to the basement, covering them with blankets and dousing them in bleach to mask the odor and stave off decomposition. With every step, they remained disturbingly detached, almost methodical. For the next few days, they would go about their lives as if nothing had happened, enjoying the illusion of freedom they had so brutally obtained. But their actions left a trail, a series of mistakes that would soon lead the authorities to uncover the ghastly truth hidden in the Larson home. The discovery of Samuel and Edith Larson's bodies and the subsequent arrest of Lillian and Jaden would shock Harper's Grove to its core. However, it was only the beginning of the unraveling nightmare, as the investigation would soon reveal layers of deception, financial manipulation, and chilling psychological deterioration that had been festering beneath the surface for years. With Samuel and Edith gone, Lillian and Jaden felt a twisted exhilaration as they embraced their newfound sense of freedom. The Larson house, with its neat, modest rooms and carefully tended garden, became a surreal haven for the teenage couple. The smell of bleach clung to the basement, and a heavy, suffocating quiet filled the house, broken only by their voices and laughter echoing through the once peaceful rooms. In an act that was as disturbing as it was brazen, they began inviting friends over for small gatherings, holding impromptu parties while the bodies of Lillian's grandparents lay hidden below. No one who attended these gatherings suspected the horror concealed beneath the surface. Lillian and Jaden masked any trace of unease with a strange, unsettling calm. They laughed easily, entertained guests with music and drinks, and played the role of carefree teenagers who seemed almost liberated. To the handful of friends who came by, it was simply Lillian rebelling, finally taking over her grandparents' house, with Jaden at her side as her partner in mischief. The thought that a crime had been committed under that roof never crossed anyone's mind. Lillian and Jaden grew increasingly comfortable with their morbid reality. They used Samuel and Edith's credit cards to buy food, supplies, and even new clothes. Each transaction gave them a thrill, as if flaunting their defiance to an invisible audience. They made plans to leave town, discussing dreams of relocating to Florida, where they believed they could start over, away from the suffocating small-town life they felt they had left behind. For a moment, they allowed themselves to believe that they could simply walk away from the lives they had taken. However, the weight of the crime was slowly closing in. Neighbors began to notice the unusual comings and goings at the Larson house, where guests arrived at odd hours, and the typically quiet home was now filled with unfamiliar faces. Some neighbors noted the absence of Samuel and Edith, their car parked in the driveway, but with no sign of them outside or at church, where they were regulars. Concerned, a few even tried knocking on the door, only to be met with vague excuses from Lillian. The polite girl they'd once known now had a vacant, unsettling smile, and her eyes flickered with something they couldn't quite place. The rumors grew, and soon the whispers reached the local police. Lillian and Jaden's masquerade began to crack when Samuel and Edith failed to show up for an important church meeting, a rare occurrence for the devout couple. Members of the congregation, alarmed by their absence, contacted the police to perform a welfare check. The initial visit yielded nothing out of the ordinary. Lillian assured officers that her grandparents had taken an impromptu trip out of town. She maintained a casual demeanor, explaining that they'd left her in charge and would return soon. With no immediate cause for suspicion, the officers left, but unease lingered in their minds. A few days later, however, another call came in, this time from a neighbor who reported an unusual smell emanating from the house. When police returned to the Larson home, Lillian and Jaden were prepared with another excuse, claiming a rodent infestation was causing the odor. But this time, officers pressed for access to the basement. Lillian hesitated, visibly flustered, and after a tense moment, she reluctantly led them down the narrow steps. The basement was dimly lit and quiet, the smell of bleach thick in the air. Despite their attempts to clean, a faint odor of decay lingered, raising alarms for the officers. After a brief search, they found the source, Samuel and Edith's bodies, concealed under blankets in the corner of the basement, decomposing beneath the very floorboards Lillian and Jaden had walked over for days. The officers' discovery shattered the teenagers' facade, and within minutes they were both in handcuffs, led out of the house as neighbors watched in horror. The small-town gossip had turned into a nightmare reality that none could have anticipated. As investigators processed the scene, they uncovered the extent of the teenagers' crime. Evidence littered the house, blood spatter in the bedroom, remnants of bleach and cleaning supplies, and receipts from the Larsons' stolen credit cards, each one a chilling reminder of the pair's calculated efforts to erase their wrongdoing. Jaden maintained a hardened silence during his interrogation, while Lillian oscillated between denial and deflection, casting blame on anyone but herself. Both teens displayed a chilling lack of remorse, more concerned with their failed escape plans than with the lives they had taken. For Harper's Grove, the arrests of Lillian Larson and Jaden Rivers marked a descent into collective shock and disbelief. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the girl they'd known with the monster the headlines portrayed. In the days that followed, media outlets descended on the quiet town, eager to capture the story of the teenager who had murdered her own grandparents. The house on Cherry Street, once a symbol of warmth and family, was now forever tainted by the gruesome events that had transpired within its walls. As the case developed, more disturbing details emerged, illuminating the dark transformation that had overtaken Lillian Larson and the boy who had become her accomplice. As investigators delved into Lillian Larson's past, they began to piece together the twisted psychology that had led her to kill her grandparents. Friends and teachers described Lillian as troubled but intelligent, with a knack for manipulating those around her. Her struggles with authority and outbursts of anger were well known, but they had been brushed off as typical teenage rebellion. Yet, interviews revealed a darker side, an inclination toward violence and a fascination with control. The arrival of Jaden Rivers only intensified this side of Lillian, amplifying her impulses rather than reining them in. Jaden, too, had a history that hinted at trouble. Coming from a broken home marked by frequent run-ins with the law, he'd grown up with a chip on his shoulder, resentful of authority and prone to outbursts. His history included minor offenses: shoplifting, vandalism, trespassing, nothing that pointed to a capacity for murder. But as psychologists would later explain, his susceptibility to influence made him an ideal match for someone like Lillian, who seemed to thrive on power and persuasion. Together, they created a volatile blend, one that pushed boundaries in ways neither could have anticipated alone. Interviews with their friends revealed how, over the months leading up to the murders, Lillian and Jaden became almost inseparable. Their relationship, initially intense and romantic, soon took on a disturbing edge. Friends remembered Lillian talking about getting rid of her problems at home, often laughing it off as a joke. Jaden, who was known for his loyalty to her, would simply nod or smirk in agreement. Their private conversations grew more sinister, laced with fantasies of freedom, rebellion, and finally violence. Psychologists reviewing the case noted the power dynamics at play. Lillian, driven by an insatiable need for control, found in Jaden a willing participant. The murders were, in a twisted way, a form of bonding, a joint commitment to a fantasy life where they were no longer restrained by anyone's rules. In their young, disturbed minds, they believed they could kill and walk away without consequence. Their mistake ultimately was in assuming that their small-town lives could be erased as easily as their grandparents' bodies. As the case built momentum, detectives scrutinized every detail of the teenagers' ill-fated scheme. What emerged was a portrait of arrogance and poor planning that betrayed their youth and lack of experience. Lillian and Jaden's attempts to hide the crime, covering the bodies with blankets, dousing them with bleach, seemed woefully inadequate under the cold eye of forensic analysis. The bleach had masked the smell for only a short time, and the bodies, when examined, revealed the brutality of the attack. Detectives noted signs of overkill, an indication of pent-up rage released in a frenzy of violence. This wasn't a clean, detached murder. It was a crime of anger, of frustration, and above all, of reckless, youthful impulsivity. Police traced every purchase made with Samuel and Edith's stolen credit cards, reconstructing the days after the murder through receipts. They found evidence of shopping sprees, new clothes, and takeout meals purchases that painted a chilling picture of the killer's lack of remorse. While their victims lay decomposing in the basement, Lillian and Jaden had dined on fast food and fantasized about the Florida beaches. Detectives marveled at their audacity, struggling to understand the disconnection from reality that seemed to drive them. As the teens awaited trial, they remained under intense observation. In custody, they were kept apart, monitored closely to prevent any further communication. Lillian's behavior alternated between indifference and agitation, at times feigning innocence and, at others, breaking down in frustration. Jaden, on the other hand, was unnervingly calm, showing little reaction to his confinement. In interviews, he offered little more than shrugs and monosyllabic responses. The two had enacted a brutal crime together, yet now each seemed determined to shift blame onto the other. With the mounting evidence, prosecutors were confident they could secure convictions for both Lillian and Jaden. But the question loomed: how would the courts handle two teenagers who had committed such a heinous crime? Their ages added complexity, stirring debate within the community and across the nation. Many argued they should face the harshest penalties available, while others questioned if their youth should afford them a chance at rehabilitation. The trial of Lillian Larson and Jaden Rivers became one of the most high-profile cases Harper's Grove had ever seen. Media from across the state descended on the small town, capturing every development in the courtroom drama. The prosecution presented a case steeped in grim detail, painting Lillian as the mastermind who manipulated Jaden into helping her carry out the murders. Prosecutors argued that the murders were premeditated, showcasing text messages and notes recovered from the teenagers' phones. These digital conversations revealed disturbing discussions of escape, fantasies of starting a new life, and ultimately, detailed planning of how they would kill Lillian's grandparents. Prosecutor Allison McCabe methodically laid out the evidence, reconstructing the night of the murders in a haunting narrative that gripped the courtroom. She emphasized the brutality of the attack, the desecration of the bodies, and the callous behavior of the defendants in the days that followed. Witnesses took the stand one by one, friends and neighbors who had interacted with Lillian and Jaden, describing their strange behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders and the twisted parties held afterward. Some friends recounted chilling statements from Lillian, comments that, in hindsight, sounded like veiled confessions. The defense, however, portrayed a different narrative. Lillian's lawyer argued that she was a troubled, manipulated young girl whose toxic relationship with Jaden had pushed her into making disastrous choices. The lawyer described her history of trauma and instability, suggesting that Lillian's actions stemmed from desperation rather than genuine malice. They argued that she was too young to fully understand the gravity of her actions, framing her as a girl misguided by a dangerous influence. Jaden's defense attorney, on the other hand, sought to shift the blame squarely onto Lillian, describing him as a misguided young man who had been manipulated into carrying out her plans. They painted Jaden as a follower, weak and easily influenced, not someone capable of orchestrating a murder. Psychologists testified on both sides, debating whether the teen's lack of remorse was a sign of psychopathy or simply youthful detachment. Expert witnesses spoke to the minds of young offenders, the implications of trying them as adults, and the potential for rehabilitation. The community was torn. Some argued that they were cold-blooded killers who deserved no mercy, while others, especially those who had once known Lillian and Jaden, wondered if they could be redeemed. As the trial wore on, new evidence came to light, offering insight into the couple's twisted dynamic. Messages exchanged between Lillian and Jaden in the days leading up to the murders showed the evolution of their plans. In one message, Lillian wrote, once they're gone, we'll finally be free. Jaden's responses often reflected a mixture of apprehension and loyalty, showing he had doubts but ultimately remained devoted to her. Investigators suggested that Lillian's desire to control extended beyond her grandparents and deeply influenced her relationship with Jaden. She used affection and manipulation to guide him toward violence, ensuring he was complicit in her fantasy of liberation. At a critical moment in the trial, a forensic psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Lane, testified that Lillian displayed signs of narcissistic and antisocial personality traits, which, when combined with the influence of Jaden, created a perfect storm for violence. Dr. Lane's testimony offered the jury a glimpse into Lillian's mind, explaining how her extreme need for control had fueled her actions. She argued that while Lillian was young, her behavioral patterns were dangerous and deeply embedded, suggesting that rehabilitation might be unlikely. Jaden, by contrast, showed signs of dependence and vulnerability, traits that had made him easily swayed by Lillian's dominance. Toward the end of the trial, Lillian herself took the stand. Dressed in a conservative outfit and coached by her attorneys, she initially presented herself as remorseful, claiming she had been lost and confused. But under cross-examination, her composed facade cracked. When pressed about specific details, her responses grew evasive, her frustration evident. Her mask slipped, and for a brief moment, the calculating side of Lillian was exposed, a chilling glimpse that was not lost on the jury. Jaden's testimony, however, was starkly different. He was quiet and visibly shaken as he recounted his involvement. He admitted to helping Lillian plan the murder, but claimed he had only gone along with her out of fear and devotion. "I didn't know how to say no," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She made it seem like there was no other way." His emotional breakdown on the stand painted a stark contrast to Lillian's demeanor, creating doubt in the minds of those observing. Was he truly a willing participant, or merely a pawn in Lillian's scheme? The trial continued for several weeks, with both sides presenting closing arguments that echoed through the courtroom. The prosecution urged the jury to see through the defense's portrayal of Lillian and Jaden as misguided teens, reminding them of the brutal details of the crime and the callous behavior that followed. The defense made a final plea for leniency, emphasizing the young age of the defendants and their potential for change. After weeks of exhaustive testimony and emotional pleas, the jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric as the judge announced the decision. Both Lillian Larson and Jaden Rivers were found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and identity theft. The community of Harper's Grove held its breath, torn between relief at the verdict and sadness over the tragedy that had unfolded within one of its own families. The sentencing phase soon followed, and it proved to be as contentious as the trial itself. Prosecutors pushed for the harshest possible punishment, arguing that the brutal and calculated nature of the crime warranted life sentences without the possibility of parole. They underscored the maliciousness in Lillian and Jaden's actions, the calculated planning, the theft of Samuel and Edith's assets, and the remorseless days they spent in the house after the murders. Their lack of remorse, prosecutors argued, suggested a level of depravity that left no room for redemption. The defense continued to fight for leniency, especially in Jaden's case, maintaining that he had been psychologically manipulated by Lillian and that his participation stemmed from fear and dependency rather than genuine intent. They presented psychological evaluations and witness testimonies attesting to his troubled past, emphasizing that his involvement was not premeditated on his part, but rather a tragic result of his vulnerability. For Lillian, her attorneys argued that her young age and history of emotional disturbance should be considered, that despite the gravity of her actions, there was potential for rehabilitation. The judge weighed the arguments, conscious of the public outcry surrounding the case and the profound impact the crime had on the community. In a solemn voice, he delivered the sentences. Both Lillian and Jaden would serve life in prison, Lillian received life without the possibility of parole, as the judge declared her as the dominant force in the murders, describing her as a manipulative and calculating individual whose actions revealed a deeply ingrained disregard for human life. Jaden, given his apparent susceptibility to Lillian's influence, received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The courtroom remained silent, the gravity of the sentences hanging heavily in the air. As they were let out, Lillian remained impassive, her face a mask of indifference, while Jaden's face showed a hint of relief, a mix of fear and resignation. The sentences marked a conclusion, yet the community and the families involved would feel the scars for years to come.